I'm here with Stephen Buhner, who is the author of several books, including Sacred Herbal and Healing Beers, which, due to my own studies into shamanism and entheogens and the history of psychoactive substances, I've felt that it was of utmost importance to give the audience an understanding of where brewing and fermentation and the history of psychoactive substances in wines and ancient beers and things like that, such as strong wine, what these things really are and how they apply. And I really think that, except for maybe a couple of researchers like Professor Carl Ruck and Stephen Buhner and maybe Michael Hoffman, the field is really void of a thorough discussion on this topic. So Stephen, I am very excited to have you on to present this side of research to the audience, and welcome aboard.
Hi, Jan. Thanks for having me on.
What three things would you say were the power behind the temperance movement?
Well, I'd kind of separate that out a little bit. The temperance movement I would label as a later phenomenon than the early prohibitions around alcohol. And during the Middle Ages, there was there were probably easily 200 or 300 different beers and ales that were commonly consumed all through Europe. And the oldest one was called Gruit. I'm talking now kind of after the fall of Rome and when the Catholic Church had become fairly predominant. The major kind of beer used back then was Gruit, and it was a blend of primarily three herbs: marsh rosemary, myricagale, and yarrow, and then they would add other stuff for flavor enhancers and things like that. And that beer didn't put the drinker to sleep, and it tended to be highly inebriating and sexually stimulating. And what began to happen was that there were competing groups. There was a monopoly. You had to pay the Catholic Church to make those kind of beers. It was kind of, like what our hop ales are today. And there were some people that were very uncomfortable with how inebriating many of these beers and ales were that other people were drinking. Gruit wasn't just the only one. Henbane ale was, the name for henbane is Pilsner. The original Pilsner was henbane ale, which was extremely psychotropic, and the German berserkers tended to drink a lot of that and then go rape and pillage, which of course irritated all of their neighbors. And so slowly there was this kind of thread of, we don't like people drinking those highly inebriating ones. And besides that, they're very sexually stimulating. We don't like that either. And there were competing merchants who wanted to make different kinds of ales that couldn't break the Catholic monopoly. So there was this huge, long-drawn process of over several centuries, which resulted finally in the German Beer Purity Act, which was about 1516 or something. And it was really, I went into this whole thing assuming it was the Catholics that wanted to stop this, but it was really the Protestants who insisted that hops be the primary plant used in ale and not these others, and primarily because hops puts the drinker to sleep and it dulls sexual drive in the male, and it just made everybody a lot easier to get along with. So I think those are the primary factors that began in that prohibitionist movement back then, and they were kind of rekindled in the temperance movement in our own day. The dislike of people being drunk and the dislike of these kind of substances, people taking. The temperance movement wasn't just a prohibitionist movement about alcohol. It was extremely active about outlawing the uses of opiums and over-the-counter drugs of many sorts cocaine and a whole lot of things. And so our kind of the FDA came into being is kind of a collaboration between the temperance prohibition movement and the American Medical Association, which gave doctors primary control over those drugs so that people couldn't get them over the counter anymore. And alcohol was just part of that thing. Not
very interesting. So what I find especially interesting with what you just commented on is that that this grew it, and that it was so psychotropic, and that the Catholics were brewing it. So here we have a direct tie between psychoactive substances and the Catholic Church's monopoly over brewing.
Yeah, and the Catholics were a lot more fun in the early days. The Christian Church had a lot more juice in the early days, and you have to realize they're coming out of a Roman framework, and even though they were going monotheistic, they were coming out of that kind of culture that was a lot more involved with the use of mind-altering substances and what you might call a hedonistic kind of approach to life, and that the kind of prohibitionist, anti-sex, anti-drugs, anti-rock and roll thing that began emerging, that emerged over a long period of time as more and more, I don't know exactly why organizations these control freaks tend to take over them as time goes on and restrict behavior and try to control behavior more and more. But the Catholic Church prior to about 1100 was fairly cool, and they began between 1100 and 1500 got worse and worse and worse and worse and worse, and the Inquisition became more and more of a choice for enforcing behavior as time came on. But early on, they were much more interesting than they were. You
discussed earlier, I'm just trying to figure out how to formulate the question here. Earlier you were discussing about the idea of bread and water and the first fermentation and that sort of thing. And in your book, you mention how fermentation itself may actually be wrapped up in the origins of civilization. Could you go into that?
Yeah, there actually are brewing anthropologists, beer anthropologists, and they're, of course, a very interesting group of people that, go around the world getting drunk, which, and they get paid for it. You can't get a better job than that. But, they're starting to find that in Egypt, which is considered to be the primary cradle of what we call civilization now, that the kind of grains that ended up being fermented tended to grow in profusion there already. And so the cultures that moved through that area, there's some evidence that's been emerging, which I tend to like myself, that they settled there because the grains grew in abundance, and they discovered that the grains could be fermented as well as used for food, and so that civilization began when we started drinking, not when we started thinking. And they actually have it the other way around, that, a lot of historians, people settled there and then they discovered fermentation later, but I think the evidence is starting to show that it was really the other way around.